History has not been fair to Antheil. Antheil has suffered, but frankly, Antheil was not fair to history either. One of the reasons he's suffered is because the autobiography that he wrote was, to a certain extent, a kind of tell-all autobiography. He insulted lots of his friends. He lied about many, many things in his life. He made up stories about himself. They're great stories. We love it. It's a great novel. George Antheil was probably one of the craziest composers of the 20th century.
No matter what he says about himself, what other people say about him, the guy took the idea of being a musician and participating in the grand musical tradition and passing this on to students. You know, he took all of this very seriously.
He's a man who's dear to my own heart because he was a great pianist, because he traveled a lot in Europe. He was somebody who was a huge innovator. He was somebody from Trenton who grew up in a modest, if not poor, background. He came from a family of shoe salesmen, and they had a little shop on Broad Street, I believe. But he dropped out of high school, and with that particular background and no education, no one assumed he was going anywhere. In fact, what happened is he went to Europe, and he was a huge hit. And that's why I love George Antheil.
He decided to go to Paris, and when he hit Paris, he realized he had found himself a home. He got to be a very high-profile figure. Everybody knew him, and he knew everybody. James Joyce, Ezra Pound, he and his wife lived in an apartment above Sylvia Beach's famous Shakespeare and Company, the bookstore in Paris, frequented by sort of all of the high-profile figures in the avant-garde at the time. Ezra Pound was a very early advocate.
Was the artistic center of the world during the 1920s. I mean, this was the place to be. And Antheil was at the top of that heap. Probably the most amazing work that Antheil wrote is called the Ballet Mécanique. And it was supposed to be the film score for a film by Fernand Léger, who was a big cubist of the time. What Antheil intended with his music in Ballet Mécanique was to find a musical representation of the visuals that Fernand Léger was using.
It's a feeling of automatic function and an identification of machines as being part of us.
If you look at the film, if you look at the footage, it's constantly intercutting between images of triangles and circles that pop on and off the screen, of balls that reflect the camera in them, of swings, of machinery going, everything moving constantly, in as many dimensions as possible. It was a huge scandal because it was probably the loudest piece, or one of the loudest pieces of the 20th century, without amplification. It had 16-player pianos, it had 7 xylophones, an airplane propeller, 2 airplane propellers, 5 doorbells, and an electric siren.
We played it in Paris and had great success with it there from the viewpoint of riots and discussions. The critiques of the concert appeared on the front pages of Parisian newspapers instead of in the back pages, mostly because there were riots and people punched one another. And the surrealists who were violently on my side in one particular concert at the Champs-Élysées came in and punched everyone who didn't like the music.
Trenton was an industrial city at the time that he was growing up. There were steel mills and the ceramics plants, and it was all about production. There were ocean-going vessels docking in the Delaware River out here. He was able to somehow, in his music, I think, reflect that culture.
He didn't see anything wrong with machines. He loved them, and he thought that was a cause for optimism. Antheil was notorious in the 20s for his antics, for his crazy stunts. And then he became well-known as a composer in the 1950s. And if he had lived another 10 years, remember, he died fairly young. He died when he was only 59 years old. If he had lived, we can imagine that he would have become maybe a more established, respected composer. He died at a bad time for his career. You could say that of a lot of people.